The Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third and final lecture, unfortunately, in this year's presentation of the Grand Du Bois Lectures. This has been a superb series, delivered by former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who comes to us this evening, unfortunately, from Stanford. Where she's the barber. I wish we played them in basketball. We'd whoop their butt, wouldn't we? They ain't got nothing. Out there playing West Coast places. What are you talking about? Where she is the Barbara and Thomas Stevenson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Now, it's very fitting that these lectures, named for my hero, the great educator, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, and delivered by a great educator, are being held this evening at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. On behalf of the Du Bois Institute, I want to thank Dean Kathleen McCartney for opening her doors to us and co-sponsoring Dr. Rice's second and third Du Bois lectures. Dean McCartney is... Oh, man, you got... They have an applause thing up here. Every time you say her name, all the students, the only way you graduate. Dean McCartney is the Gerald S. Lesser Professor in Early Childhood Development. She's a specialist in early experience and development, particularly with respect to child care, early childhood education, and their complex relationship to poverty. She's a member of the NICHD Early Child Care Research Network. She co-edited a book entitled The Blackwell Handbook of Early Childhood Development. In the year 2009, Dean McCartney received the Distinguished Contribution Award from the Society for Research in Child Development. She's a fellow of the American Education Research Association, the American Psychology Association, and the American Psychological Society. Dean McCartney, a dear friend, will now introduce another dear friend, Condoleezza Rice. Thank you, Kathy, for welcoming us into your house. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all of you, for being here for this very special event. In a commencement speech that Condoleezza Rice gave at Boston College, she said, and I quote, "Education is transformational. It literally changes lives. That is why people work so hard to become educated, and that is why education has always been the key to the American dream. The force that erases arbitrary divisions of race and class and culture and unlocks every person's God-given potential." It is such an honor to host Dr. Rice here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education as part of our Ask With Forum series. And as Skip just said, she will deliver her final lecture today as part of the W.E.B. Du Bois lecture series on foreign policy and the Black experience. As we all know, Dr. Rice served as the 66th United States Secretary of State in the administration of President George W. Bush, and she was the first African-American woman to do so. She also served as President Bush's National Security Advisor during his first term, and before joining the Bush administration, she was a professor of political science at Stanford, where she served as provost from 1993 to 1991. She also served as the Soviet and East European Affairs Advisor to President George H.W. Bush during the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the German reunification. She is the daughter of two educators. Dr. Rice knows the value of good teaching, and she practices what she preaches in this regard. As a professor at Stanford, she's won two of the highest teaching honors. In 1984, she was awarded the Walter J. Goris Award for Excellence in Teaching, and in 1993, she received the School of Humanities and Sciences Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching. She has authored and co-authored numerous books. Her most recent is a memoir entitled Extraordinary Ordinary People, a Memoir of Family. It tells her story of growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, during the turbulent era of the Civil Rights Movement. And I love that she's written two versions of this book, one for adults and one for young adults. In a recent interview, she said she wants young people to understand that as my parents believed and convinced me, You may not be able to control your circumstances, but you can certainly control how you react to your circumstances, and education is really the key to be able to do that. The W.E.B. Du Bois Lectures were established in 1981 with funding from the Ford Foundation. They're co-sponsored with Harvard University Press, and these lectures recognize persons of outstanding achievement who have contributed to our better understanding of African American life, history, and culture. Condoleezza Rice spoke on Tuesday about U.S. policy in Africa. Yesterday, she spoke on multi-ethnic democracy. And today, the title of her talk is Why Democracy Matters, Education, Empowerment, and the American National Myth at Home and Abroad. So Dr. Rice is going to give some brief remarks, and then I'll join her on the stage and we'll take your questions. So put your thinking caps on. Please keep your questions rather short and succinct so that we can get as many questions in as possible. Okay? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's a delight to be here. Some of you I've seen for the last 3 days. Others, perhaps this is the first time, but thank you very much. And I'd like to thank my good friend, Professor Skip Gates, for inviting me to give these Du Bois lectures. It's been a wonderful experience. I would like to thank Dean McCartney, both for welcoming us here to the School of Education and for your leadership of the school here. Harvard is well known as one of the finest schools of education in the nation, and one that is pioneering in so many fields. And so thank you for your leadership. I indeed have, over the last few days, talked about a number of issues: U.S. policy toward Africa, multi-ethnic democracy. We've had very good exchange about a whole range of issues. I hope we can continue that exchange today. I know there will be questions, but you have to understand I'm a professor, and so if there aren't questions, I know how to call on people, so get your questions ready. When I was, as I've said at the beginning of the other lectures, when I was asked to give the Du Bois lectures, I wanted to think about how to put what I might say and my experiences as a specialist in foreign policy, as a former Secretary of State, into the context of this great man, W.E.B. Du Bois, a man who was, of course, a complicated man and complicated in his views. Someone who struggled with the relationship between Africa and the diaspora, which is why I wanted to talk about U.S. policy toward Africa and the redemption of both America and Africa through the linkage of the stolen daughters and sons of Africa, who were the founding populations of this country, and indeed now can provide a link back to a continent that should finally get out of the category of potential and actually realize that potential. And then yesterday, to look at how Du Bois thought about the broad concept of race and ethnicity and nationality. He was someone who struggled with capitalism and explored and in fact adopted communism. He was someone who struggled with Africa and adopted Pan-Africanism for a while, but he was also somebody, ironically, who believed very much in the power of democracy. He talked a great deal about the importance of political representation, political activity within the context of democratic institutions. And most importantly, for the topic that I wish to talk about today, he was very interested in how the talented tenth, as he called them, might in fact lead Black America to do better than the Black America that he knew. And of course, he was incredibly distressed, not just by what he had experienced in the Northeast, where he would, after all, go on to be a Harvard student and receive advanced degrees at Harvard, including a PhD, struggling to do that, but then before going to Fisk University, where he saw racism and segregation in full bloom. And so for this man to contemplate how Black Americans might advance through the phalanx, the vanguard of a talented 10th, is the context in which I would like to introduce my discussion today about the American national myth at home and abroad, empowerment and education. Now, when you're Secretary of State, you have the best job in government. My good friend George Shultz, who, as I said to him, should know, since he was Secretary of Labor, he was Secretary of Treasury, he was the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. He'd had a lot of important jobs in government. And when I was about to become Secretary, he said, "It's the best job in government." And I said, "Why is that, George?" And he said, "Well, trust me, you'll find out." And he was right. The reason it's the best job in government is that you get to represent the United States, you get to represent all that the United States stands for, and you get to bring, to the degree that you can, the tremendous assets and power of the United States to try and do better for the world. And in fact, even when the United States makes mistakes, and it most certainly does make mistakes, I think many believe in the world that it is still a model that is exemplary and, in fact, different from any model in the world. So when you're Secretary of State, you get to go out and you get to see what people admire about us, what they like about us, and what they don't. Sometimes they find American military power a bit frightening. Sometimes they find and resent American military power, although, to be very frank, when there is hard work to do out on the front lines of freedom, people are generally glad that there's an American military that can do that work. Sometimes our economic prowess is resented as people look at the economic and cultural penetration of the United States into their societies. I mean, after all, how many MTVs are there around the world? And sometimes that is indeed resented, although people depend on a robust American economy to lead economic recovery out of the global recession in which we currently find ourselves, and they look to American economic power to deal with everything from earthquakes and humanitarian disasters to the AIDS pandemic to foreign assistance to the developing world. But the one thing that I found universally to have been admired about the United States around the world is what I will call the great American national myth. Now, a myth is not something that is necessarily untrue. It's just something that is outsized in your thinking. For some countries, that great national myth is something like, we lost that territory in 1389 and we're going to get it back. Now, that's not a really healthy national myth. But the American great national myth is the log cabin. It is, you can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things. It doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. If you work hard, then you can achieve. And it is what has drawn people from around the world to try to be a part of that throughout generations now. People who immigrated first from Europe and then from continent after continent to try to take a part in that extraordinary belief that it didn't matter where you came from, it mattered where you were going. And it led, frankly, some of the most ambitious people from around the world to try and come to be a part of that. I remember having a conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of the Singaporean state. And we were just sitting there, and he said to me, quite out of the blue, "Do you know why the United States will always lead economically?" he said. And this was somebody who, Lee Kuan Yew, had his reservations about the United States in many ways. But he said, "Do you know why you will always lead?" And I said, "No." He said, "Because if you are a really brilliant young software engineer, then you might go to Germany or you might go to Japan, but you will never be Japanese and you will never be German. But you can go to the United States and you might just be American. And that means that you can draw the best and the brightest and the most ambitious, people who are willing to lay down everything and go and have completely different experience. Those people will always be attracted to you." Now, the interesting thing is that those people have come both from the end of the spectrum, where somebody comes, crawls across the desert to make $5, not 50 cents, all the way to people like Sergey Brin, whose parents brought him here from Russia when he was 7 years old, and he founded Google. And that life's blood of the United States through immigration is the reason that the United States has neither the sclerotic demographics of Europe or Japan, nor the tragic demographics of Russia. A country, by the way, that in 25 years or so, if it continues with its low birth rates and its very early death rates, particularly among men, 140 million Russians could be 100 million Russians. So very tragic demographics. Immigration has been the way that the United States has dealt with it. And so people coming here from around the world meant that to be American can be African American or Indian American or Korean American, Muslim or Jew or Protestant or Catholic, but American. And that has meant then that the country has attracted these ambitious people. The great national American myth then has worked well for immigration. It doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. But it also worked as the central premise for people who were born here. It was the central premise for people that even if your life was not as you might want it to be, the life of your children would be better. And it would be better because you would do everything that you possibly could to educate them and to have them be better educated than you were. And there are countless stories of illiterate families that still want to educate their children. Now, when I decided to write the book, Extraordinary Ordinary People, I did so in part to be able to tell this very American story, this very American narrative about the importance of this great national myth in my own family. I love telling stories, and I think stories are very often a way to understand both context and how that context affects how human beings develop. And so let me tell you a little bit about the story of the Rices and the Rays and how they took advantage of this great American national myth that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. My punchline, in effect, is that I should have ended up where I did. Not because of just my hard work and my talents, but because a long time ago in the history of the Rices and Rays, people believed that education was transformative. The story begins with my great-grandmother, Julia Head, on my father's side. Julia Head was a freed slave, freed late in the emancipation. Julia Head had been, we believe, a house slave and a favored house slave. There were great apocryphal stories about her during the Civil War, running off the Union soldiers and protecting the family horses. I say possibly apocryphal because we know how these stories are translated from generation to generation. But what is true about Julia Head is that she would sit on the front porch with a shotgun in her lap and a pipe in her mouth. And I wondered if maybe she thought she was going to have to run off the Union soldiers again throughout her life. But the important thing about Julia Head from the point of view of education is that she had been taught to read. And so when my grandfather, my father's father, was born, she taught him and all of his siblings to read. My grandfather, Granddaddy Rice, John Wesley Rice Sr., took very strongly to this thing called reading. And he took very strongly to this thing called education. And he managed somehow to get himself through 10 years of school, despite the fact that he was a sharecropper's son and had to work the land practically all day. And so when he was about 19 years old, he decided that it was now time to get book learning in a college. And so he asked the people who would come by, how could a colored man go to college? They told him about Little Stillman College. It was a Presbyterian school about 30 miles from where he lived in Utah. That would be E-U-T-A-W, Alabama. And I'm really not kidding, E-U-T-A-W, after the Indian tribe. My grandfather asked how he could get to college. Well, he went off to Stillman College with his cotton to pay for his college. And they allowed him to pay for his first year with cotton. The problem was, then came the second year, and he didn't have any more cotton. So they said, you're going to have to leave. he said, well, how are those boys going to college? And they said, well, they had what was called a scholarship. And if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, then you could have a scholarship too. And my granddaddy said, you know, that's exactly what I had in mind. My family has therefore been college educated and Presbyterian, by the way, ever since. But the Presbyterians had taken in the South a mission of educating young black people, particularly young men, and they loved to turn them into preachers. Whether at Stillman College or Knoxville College or Johnson C. Smith, the Presbyterians thought that the best profession for young black men was to be preachers. My grandfather was happy to oblige. Granddaddy Rice, having gotten his education and having gotten his seminary degree, and he was always very, very proud of the fact that he was a preacher who had studied theology, not just somebody who declared himself a preacher. He went on then to educate his children, because Granddaddy Rice somehow understood that education was in and of itself transformative, that it was not just going to change him into somebody that he would otherwise not be, but it was going to change generations after him. And so he was someone who believed that that gift of education had to be transmitted to others. He was, therefore, as a minister, not just a minister, but an educational evangelist. Throughout Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama, he would found a church and a school next door. And he would take contributions from the community in order to fund his school. Now, my grandfather was a very smart man, and he once told my father that his best ally was white guilt, because he would go to the white community and he'd get $5 here and $5 there and 50 cents in his own community, and he would build these magnificent schools. I had the great advantage and the great honor to see one of his schools in Scotlandville, Louisiana, which is still there. And Granddaddy Rice educated a lot of people in his schools. But he did more than just evangelize for education. He then really worked hard to make sure that it could be delivered. So he would go door to door, and he would make a deal with a historically black college like Stillman or Johnson C. Smith. He would go to a parent, perhaps a parent who was not himself or herself educated, and say, you know, your daughter is smart, and I want her to go to college. And then he would get a scholarship for that student, and in return, the schools would send him teachers who would then populate his schools. He was an educational evangelist. Of course, where it came to his own children, he was determined that they would too be very well educated, and indeed they were. My father, who described himself as not a terribly serious student, my father was a great athlete, nonetheless finished college and went to seminary and himself became a minister. I'll return to that in a minute. But my Aunt Teresa, my father's sister and John Wesley Rice Sr.'s daughter, went off to the University of Wisconsin, and in 1952, she became one of the first black women to get a PhD at the University of Wisconsin. She got it in Victorian literature. She wrote books on Dickens. So whenever anybody thought that it was strange that I did what I did as a black person and studied the Soviet Union, I reminded them that I had an aunt who, in fact, wrote books about Dickens. Now, the Rice family then was very much dedicated to this proposition of education. And my grandfather also tried to build a very intellectual environment in his home. And one of the great stories that was passed down to me, because Granddaddy Rice died 2 months before I was born. But I've always felt this tremendous connection to him, and my father told me that during the height of the Great Depression, he came home one day, my grandfather, very excited because he had 9 leather-bound, gold-embossed books that he had bought. The works of Dumas, the works of Shakespeare, the works of Victor Hugo. My grandmother, a practical woman who had been trying to make ends meet during the Depression, said to him, "How much did those cost?" He said, $90, height of the Great Depression. He said, "But don't worry, Teresa." He said, "We can buy them on time, $3 a month for the next 3 years." Well, she tried to convince him to take them back. He refused to take them back, and I was very grateful that he did not, because on the day that I went to receive my PhD, my father gave me the 5 surviving gold embossed leather-bound books. They sit today on my mantle at Stanford. So the Rices were dedicated to education, but so were the Rays. Granddaddy Ray, my mother's father, was not himself an educated man and did not have the opportunity to go to college, although he learned several trades and worked as a coal mining engineer during the day, built houses on the weekend, and shorn horses as a blacksmith whenever he could get the work. But he and my grandmother was a very well-educated woman for her day. She had gone to a finishing school. She had studied music with a Viennese master. They together educated my mother's side of the family. Now, the fact is, it was not easy to educate the Ray children. There were 5 of them. My mother and her sister went to Miles College, finished, and became teachers. But the other 3, my Uncle Albert, my Aunt Genoa, her name's really Genoa, but we call her Genoa because we're from the South, and my Uncle Alto, well, they had to be educated several times. And again, the story is one that might be somewhat resonant for families. My Uncle Albert, the eldest child, went to Stillman along with his sisters, but then dropped out and went to Pennsylvania to find his fame and fortune, taking his young wife and his first child with him. When my grandfather learned that he was working in the steel mills in Pennsylvania, my grandfather got on a train, went to Pennsylvania, brought them back, deposited my uncle back in school at Stillman, got a scholarship for him, and my uncle finished college. When he found that my Uncle Alto had left school at Southern University, he got on a train, went and got my uncle, brought him back, deposited him in Southern, where my Aunt Teresa, my father's sister, was teaching, and he finished college and became a teacher. And then there was my Aunt G, who went to Spelman College out of high school. And one day, my grandparents learned from the school that my aunt had left school and gone to New York, and was in fact planning to marry an Irish boy that she had met there. My grandfather got on the train, went to New York, got my aunt, and brought her back, depositing her in Norfolk, Virginia, where my Aunt Teresa was now teaching at Norfolk State. G got her degree, got her master's degree, and became a special needs teacher and later principal. The point of these stories is that these were people who would do anything to educate their children. They believed fundamentally in the transforming power of education. Now that was then, of course, passed on to my family as well. My parents were themselves educators. They were in some ways ordinary people. My mother was a school teacher. She taught first English, and one of her first students was the great ball player Willie Mays at Fairfield Industrial High School. Now, Willie Mays told me that he remembered my mother very well because she had told him, "Son, you're going to be a ball player, and if you need to leave class a little bit early, you go right ahead and do that." And he obviously appreciated this insight by my mother. My father was a high school athletic director, later on a high school guidance counselor and Presbyterian minister. But they were dedicated to the proposition that I think W.E.B. Du Bois would have concurred with, that yes, there could be a talented 10th, but they were absolutely determined that that talented 10th would have no class implication. And so what they wanted to do was to look for kids who could succeed regardless of their circumstances. In my little black middle-class community of Titusville, we were a community of 2-parent families, mostly teachers, 1 lawyer, 1 doctor. It perhaps isn't surprising that the children in my community all knew that we were going to go to college. In fact, the messages were so strong about going to college that sometimes you just wanted to say, "All right, I get it, I'm going to college." I remember that my parents, for instance, when we would go on family trips, we would go and visit college campuses. We once went 150 miles out of the way to see Ohio State. Now, we visited college campuses like most people visited national parks. They were trying to send very strong messages, but the message in Titusville was not, do you want to go to college? It was, where are you going to college? And that was very strong. But perhaps not so surprising for our little community. More surprising for the kids outside of our little community who weren't so fortunate as to have educated parents. Like his father, my father was a minister and had a church in Birmingham, Westminster Presbyterian Church, which is still there. It celebrated its 65th anniversary last month. And behind Westminster Presbyterian Church, there was a place called Loveman Village. It was a government project, as we called it back in the day. And those children were very much the target of my father's educational evangelism. Through his youth fellowship, a program in which he brought kids from all over the community to his church at 4 o'clock every Sunday. And by the way, he had an advantage because my father was a Presbyterian. Unlike the Baptists, he could have dances at his church and often did to attract students. But much of what youth fellowship did was to make the educational experience available to more than just the community. This was actually fairly controversial in his middle-class church. The members believed that these programs really ought to be for the children of the church, not for the children of Loveman Village. They therefore, my father's elders, the ruling body of the Presbyterian Church, defunded his, as they called it, social ministry. He then went to the women of the church and had his ministry funded. So this ministry, as he saw it, of educational outreach became very key. Every Tuesday and Thursday night at Westminster was tutoring night. Teachers coming from Ullman High School and other high schools and tutoring in algebra and tutoring in chemistry and tutoring in languages so that these kids could have an education that my father thought worthy and an education that would make up for the frankly fairly poor state of black schools in Birmingham, Alabama. Not only that, but like his father, he went door to door with scholarships in hand for children who were smart, as he would put it. And the list of kids that were produced out of this community is really quite remarkable. Kids like Freeman Rabowski, who grew up down the street from me, who is currently the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the current president of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a woman who was the first black governor of the IMF under Ronald Reagan, a woman who is a Pulitzer Prize winner and columnist, Cheryl McCarthy, and also the first National Achievement Scholar in the state of Alabama, the head of the largest trauma unit in the country, King's Hospital in Los Angeles, and on and on and on. But among them, too, were kids who came from Loveman Village. The woman who headed the entire Birmingham public library system, one of these young women who was sent to college by this community and by this church. A Pulitzer Prize winner who also credits the fact that he had 5 siblings and his father died when he was very young, crediting this church for his success. And so the talented 10th, as Du Bois would have called them, were not just the children of the privileged middle class. They were the children also who showed promise and were able to take advantage of the educational opportunities offered to them. Now, educational empowerment was for this community more than just a moral cause. It was also quite instrumental. You see, growing up in the circumstances of the segregated South, where you couldn't go to a restaurant, where your parents had to find a way to tell you that the reason you couldn't go to that movie theater was that you were black, where your parents had to explain why it was, as little friend of mine, parents had to, that you couldn't go to Kittyland. You can imagine that that might have been an environment in which people felt oppressed and victimized, marginalized, and where horizons would have been limited. Well, education was, from their point of view, the answer to that. Because if you could speak English, better than they did, meaning the white man, if you could recite their literature better than they did, if you could play their music better than they did, then they might not like you, but they had to respect you. And you could build a life that was fulfilling and productive and a life of dignity. And therefore, for the families and the people of segregated Birmingham, education was a kind of armor against racism and prejudice that allowed them to build this productive and dignified life. They believed that you might not be able to control these circumstances, but you could control your response, and you were better able to control your response if you were educated. In these communities, the highest regard was held for teachers and for principals. If you were a teacher in the Birmingham public school system, oh my goodness, you had arrived. The day that a family learned that their son or daughter had received a teaching job was a happy one for them. And you should have seen the event that was the New Teachers Conference every year, held at the Civic Center in Birmingham, with every teacher, every new teacher in suit and tie, the women in hats and gloves. It was quite a moment for the Birmingham community. And oh, by the way, as my uncle found out, it was also a great way to meet a mate. That's how my uncle met his wife at the New Teachers Conference. The principals were even more gigantic figures. People like Mr. R.C. Johnson, the principal of Parker High School, the largest high school in Birmingham, and the father of Alma Johnson Powell, Colin Powell's wife, and Mr. George C. Bell, her uncle, by the way, who was the principal of Ullman High School. And even the principals of elementary schools were considered towering figures, like Mr. W.W. Whetstone. When Mr. Whetstone unexpectedly died of a heart attack, the funeral that was held for him rivaled anything that you would see for a great political figure now. My point in relaying this is that the profession of educating was also valued above all else. You had a few doctors and you had a few lawyers, but not so many in the segregated South. But to be a teacher, this was the highest calling. In return, these teachers expected the best of their students. To be in a classroom where you were told you will have to be twice as good, not as a matter of debate, but as a matter of fact. Teachers expected the highest performance. They tried to help those who could not perform, but the high standards were held, you were held to account to high standards. You were told there are no victims and no excuses. Now, this narrative that I've related to you, I hope helps people to understand why in a place like Birmingham, with all of those circumstances of prejudice, all of those circumstances of limited horizons, so many very, very successful people emerged. And it says something about our challenge today in making certain that the talented 10th are not just the children of the educated and the children of the well-heeled, but in fact that education, as the great equalizer, is available so that the talented 10th represents a broad section of the United States and a broad section of our diversity and within the race. It's essential for the United States that this be true. And of course, the key to this is K12 education and whether or not children are actually able to access those educational benefits. Today, I have to say, I am concerned about this when I can look at your zip code and tell whether or not you're going to get a good education. And I will tell you that this is terrifying to me. First, it's terrifying to me as an educator because I realize that without access to education, we are never going to know whether the potential of the person who might have found the cure for cancer is being sacrificed because they never had that chance. It is, for me, terrifying as an educator because I love to stand in front of a class at Stanford, and I'm sure you can do so at Harvard, and see that on the one hand, there is a fourth generation Stanford legatee, and sitting next to that kid is an itinerant farm worker's son. Now, without a K12 education, and I mean public school education, the chance that that will continue to be the composition of a class for Stanford or for Harvard is very slim. That will mean that for the United States of America, and here my concern goes from being that of an educator to being that of a former Secretary of State, it means that our competitiveness as a country is clearly at risk, and our ability and willingness to be open to the world is clearly at risk. You see, if we try to hold on to the days when the $18 an hour unskilled labor job was the way that you made a decent living in the United States, we're not going to be able to do it. The truth is that the United States occupies in the global economy that upper tier where knowledge and the ability to create and innovate is at the core of whether or not you're going to get a good job. Ask the people on Route 128, ask the people in the Silicon Valley if they can find enough engineers, and they will tell you no. And so somehow, the creation of an educational system in which people can get the skills that they need is very important. Otherwise, the United States will not lead, it will turn inward, it will try to protect, and we will never be able to protect as effectively as others can protect. And the economic pie will get smaller, not larger. And so as a former Secretary of State, I worry about the competitiveness of the United States and the willingness of the United States to look outward and to lead. So as an educator, it's the lost potential. As a former Secretary of State, it's the loss of leadership. But as an American, I worry about one other thing. This great national myth that it does not matter where you came from, it matters where you're going, that you can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things, is what unites Americans. America is an idea. It's not, as we discussed yesterday, a nation state. To be an American is to be from multiple ethnic and national backgrounds. It's to be from multiple religious backgrounds or no religion at all, and to still be an American. That belief in upward mobility, as it's sometimes called, in a better life for the next generation, explains in large part why Americans embrace their unity and embrace their great national idea. Now, if in fact that great national belief is no longer true, particularly for the least of our kids, particularly for the child who needs the public schools to have that child read at third grade level by the time they're third grade. If that's not available to those children, we risk the rending of the fabric of this society. Since it is really that thread that holds us together, if we break that thread, then our optimism and our confidence and our sense of who we are is going to disappear very, very quickly. We're fortunate that we don't have a great national myth that makes us hang on to the past, like so many countries in the world, trying to hang on to something that happened hundreds of years ago to unite them. Our great national myth has always united us about the future, that the future is going to be better for the American people than the past was. The key to that is whether or not people can access the great transforming power of education. I think that W.E.B. Du Bois was very wise to focus on how Black America might be led by a talented 10th to do much better under even very difficult circumstances. But it is not just a challenge for Black Americans. It is a challenge for Americans as a whole. Thank you very much.
Terrific. I think everyone can hear me. And we have microphones where people can go to ask their questions, but I think I'll just start off while
Sure,
people are getting
yes.
organized. Can you speak just a little bit more to your last point? In the 50 largest U.S. cities, only 52% of children graduate from high school. So why is it that children today aren't adhering to the, excuse me, the great American national myth? I mean, is it something to do with the schools themselves? Is it something to do with the families? Is it something to do with the messaging that we're giving our children?
Right. Well, we have several problems. We have not reacted as a country to globalization fast enough in terms of its implications for the American workforce and for education. And so the disconnect between the jobs that are actually available as a result of globalization and the jobs for which most Americans are prepared has been growing over time, and we've lost time. Secondly, I do believe that some of the problem of the breakdown of the family structure is at fault. I know that my mother often said that in her last couple of years of teaching it was the hardest time because she didn't feel that she had the parental support that she could count on,
Yes.
even in the poorest circumstances in Birmingham. But that's not fully an excuse. I started a program with some friends in 1992 called the Centers for a New Generation, and it's an after-school and summer enrichment program for kids in East Palo Alto and East Menlo Park. It's a very poor area, very close to Stanford. And what was remarkable to me is the degree to which, even if these parents were not particularly comfortable in the milieu of education, they cared about what happened to their kids. Mm-hmm. They simply didn't really have access to doing for their kids what they wanted to do. So somehow the breakdown of the family is in part to explain, but mobilizing parents doesn't seem to be a problem if you really work at it. The final point really does go to the schools, and look, I understand the importance of self-esteem. But I've always thought that self-esteem actually came from accomplishing something, not from being told that you had accomplished something even if you hadn't. It goes all the way from, everybody gets a medal on the soccer team to something I was relating to Skip earlier. I was helping my cousin's daughter do her homework a few years back, and she said 9 times 5 is 40. And I said, that's not right. I said, that's wrong. She said, there are no wrong answers. I thought, yeah, there are. 9 times 5 is 40 is one of them. And so it's really important somehow that there be that excellence be demanded of the students, that excellence be demanded of the teachers, and I sometimes think that standards have simply slipped. They've simply slipped.
Okay. Well, there are lots of people. I hope people over here will line up. There's a microphone over here too, but why don't we begin with the woman at the microphone to the right?
I'm Linda Haywood, Director of African American Studies at Boston University. And I'm intrigued by your own personal life story and that the way in which you portray the sort of national myth, because it is, in fact, a very much an American story. And what my question is, why it is that this story is not, in fact, part of the requirement in schools, that the African American story be part, a central part, a required part, because it is so much exemplifies that myth. I find myself teaching African American history from a global perspective, and I get few students who are interested in this, and those students who do take the course say, oh, I'm learning so many things about American history that I didn't know. Yes. The whole experience of being, in fact, Southern and coming to the North, and all every element of the American myth is encompassed in the African American experience, which in fact broadens and makes sense of the American experience. So I wonder if you can speak to that. Why is it not that African American story become also part of the American story?
Yes, I agree with you completely. I think in part, it's easy to divorce it and to talk about it as the civil rights story. The civil rights story is a very important part of American history, but told from the perspective of the leadership of the story. It's much like the fact that European history is often told about kings and queens. It's not told about what life is like. One thing that I wanted to do with this story was to talk about how in this context, it looks for a family, for a little girl. And my great friend Clay Carson, who's a great historian of the Black experience, said to me, it's all right to tell it as the story of a little girl. And maybe if we can get more stories that really do relate the degree to which the Black story, the Black American story, has some unique aspects, but it's very much in the context of an America which, despite the fact that America did not embrace blacks, did not embrace African Americans embraced America. And that's a very interesting psychological reaction. When you think about it, yes, there were always people, even W.E.B. Du Bois, who toyed with the notion of Pan-Africanism or separatism or something. But for the most part, the narrative, the engagement, the dialogue was about how to make America be what it said it was. And embracing the principles, embracing the values, not in any way rejecting them, and even in times when America was not embracing Black America. So I think it is an absolutely fundamental part of the American story.
Okay. Next question.
How you doing? I'm Ryan, a student here at the Education School. And you spoke a bit about the importance of high expectations in your own life. And I wonder if this whole notion of the talented 10th has become antiquated, that in fact, we're setting low expectations, and that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that only a few of us, just the top of the surface, will make it out. And then we depend on them to come back and save the rest.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think that, Souls of Black Folks is one of my favorite books. I'm an alumnus of Morehouse, and we will often talk about, was Du Bois speaking to his time, and now we have to move beyond that or build upon that. And I just wonder if you could give a little bit of feedback there.
Great question.
It's a really great question. And it's a challenging question because I am mostly concerned. Look, not everybody is going to emerge to lead a corporation or to go to Harvard or to do the things that we think of as being in the forefront of America. Not everybody's going to emerge. By definition, some percentage of people, small percentage of people, are going to be, quote, at the top. So my concern has always been, how can we assure that that top is A, racially diverse, which we've had a problem with, of course, shows gender diversity, which we've had a problem with, and shows socioeconomic diversity. And I think that's actually the hardest one, because it's very easy, and this is why I don't think the concept of the talented 10th is necessarily dangerous if it's thought about in the right way, which is trying to not just identify people who are talented, but let people self-identify as talented and willing to work hard and to get to the top. And doing it in a way that doesn't count on having gone to a really fine kindergarten, followed by a really fine elementary school, followed by Exeter, which then gets you into Harvard, right. Which can, by the way, be both gender and race neutral now. So we have the potential that we are going to have race, class conflated in a way that means socioeconomic diversity isn't being satisfied. And that's been my biggest, that's why I say, at a place like Stanford, I worry that itinerant farm workers' kid's not going to make it in. But the real question is, who identifies the talented 10th? Do they self-identify? One of the things we did with the Center for New Generation was we said you had to have a C average to get in. Right? We did not want this to be a talented 10th enrichment program. We wanted you to have a C average because that showed you were somehow trying, and you needed a teacher recommendation because we wanted kids who weren't going to be disruptive. So one little boy named Oscar kept showing up at the center every day. Center was from 3 to 6 every day. So imagine this. These kids do after-school education 3 to 6 every day. So Oscar shows up every single day. And finally the teacher says, you know, Oscar, you weren't selected for the center. And he says, well, Mrs. Bailey, I know why I wasn't selected for the center. I am what they call a behavior problem. He said, but he's 10 years old. He says, but I wouldn't be a behavior problem in the center because I like what you do. So obviously Oscar's in the next day, right? But I use the story because you have to be a bit careful about selecting that talented 10th and continually replicating the same lines into the talented 10th. I think that's the danger with the concept.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here today. I guess it's one question, but it's 2 parts. I'm sorry. But in what ways the American myth challenged both when our foreign policy, like you mentioned, at times people fear the U.S. militarily. There have been examples of extraordinary rendition or other things where we've taken other citizens and done horrible things to them, and in your position, I'm sure you'd had to explain to other countries about this circumstance, but also domestically, issues of undocumented students who are reaching a point where they could go to college, but they're not allowed to, and this sort of whole shadow population of students. To what extent are we welcoming them in, and to what extent do our foreign policy travails help impede our ability to have ed reform domestically?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Look, the United States is not perfect, and the United States in foreign policy is often challenged to deal simultaneously with security issues and keeping the country safe and more openness. I remember, by the way, rendition has been going on for a long, long time in the world. Probably more renditions were done by the French against the Algerians than by any country in human history. And so it is a tool that has been used because when you are dealing in terrorism, you must do things legally, and we were determined to try to do that. But you also recognize that there are laws, that in the laws of war, you're not doing law enforcement. And so it's a complicated problem to try to deal with terrorism. That aside, the point about, for instance, undocumented students and like, look, I think our problem on immigration is another one that's ripping us apart. I don't understand why a comprehensive immigration reform bill that George W. Bush, John McCain, and Ted Kennedy all wanted couldn't get through the U.S. Senate, except that it's a very easy issue to demagogue, and it's easy to show people crawling across grainy video across the border, and then people demagogue it. You can't continue as a great democracy to live with 10 to 12 million people living in the shadows. It doesn't make sense for the country, particularly given that a lot of these are people who are working and they're trying to make a living and they're trying to do better for their families and they'd like to send their kids to college. But I think you're going to have to deal with that problem through comprehensive immigration reform and dealing with people who are living in the shadows. I'm all for doing it.
Do you support the DREAM Act?
You know, I've looked at the DREAM. I haven't really looked at the details of the DREAM Act. I kind of like the idea of the DREAM Act. I don't know enough about the act itself to know whether it's something that I would support. I like the idea, certainly if somebody serves in our armed forces, they ought to be considered very, very forthrightly for citizenship. I don't understand why you would allow someone to serve in your armed forces and not want them to be an American.
Good point. Next.
Thank you. My name is Mariam Chuktai. I'm a doctoral student here, and I'm from Pakistan. I wanted to ask you a question, both as a scholar and you being the scholar and one of the leaders of American foreign policy as well. You said that the ability and willingness to be open to the world is an important part of our education. I want to ask you, how do educationists in the United States, first of all, strike the balance between teaching the children to be open to the world, but at the same time, when those kids are faced with a larger reality where foreign policy decisions and goals, although they're very complex, contradict that, where the United States is in other countries, and the other is sometimes painted as a blanket other, evil, or different. And I asked that question as a Pakistani educationist as well in future, that you mentioned that in other countries there's animosity towards United States. So if that's an admirable goal in other parts of the world to be open to the US, how is that possible when drone attacks continue in other parts of the world and invasions continue in other parts of the world?
Well, let's talk about Pakistan specifically, because look, this is a country that is trying to find a way to democracy out of extremism. Ever since Zia al-Haq, Pakistan in official channels had a kind of deal with extremism. And a modern Pakistan, as Musharraf said in December 2001, a modern Pakistan cannot be an extremist Pakistan. And so we actually tried very hard, for instance, to help in education reform in Pakistan, giving considerable grants to the Pakistanis to deal with the regulation of madrasas, which is a huge problem in Pakistan. Now, if you look at the fight against terrorists and drone attacks, which have accelerated over the last few years, everybody admits that, you're looking at not just terrorists who are a threat to the United States, but terrorists who are a threat to Pakistan. Benazir Bhutto was killed by a Pakistani terrorist. And so Pakistan and the United States share an interest in both the fight against terrorists and in diminishing the extremism within Pakistan. And so I don't think, I do know that sometimes people say, well, you're just fighting your war on our territory. But I think Pakistanis finally kind of came to this when, a couple of years ago, when the Taliban was 60 miles from Karachi. And all of a sudden you say, oh, wait a minute, maybe this isn't just about New York City. Maybe this is also about Karachi. So my point is that we are united, I think, in the desire for a more modern, more democratic, more tolerant states throughout South Asia and the Middle East. And that is the message that we have tried to, not just the Bush administration, but the Obama administration as well, has tried to deliver. Sometimes you have to do very tough things with terrorists, like use drone strikes, because these are not people who are operating as terrorists in the Northwest frontier who wish to sit down and have a discussion about the transforming power of education. They just don't, right? And so you get them or they get you. But the broader problem, the context in which they arose, was one in which there wasn't enough democracy, there wasn't enough economic growth, there wasn't enough tolerance, there wasn't enough modernity. And so you work at the same time on those symptoms. And you know, as I said, the United States doesn't always get it right, but I think the motives are right here.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Good afternoon. I'm Shauna. I am a first-year doctoral student here. We spent some time yesterday in our pro-sem looking at Sean Reardon's research that suggested that a lot of the gaps we see between the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile income-wise are evident in 4-year-olds. And so my question for you is, how do you think we as a society and as educators reconcile this and deal with the institutionalized inequality and the increased class segregation that is really different from the racial segregation you experience that really was socioeconomically far more diverse?
Yes, yes, and that is one of the challenges, because whatever you wanted to say about segregated Birmingham, it was, even though it was pretty stratified, it had all socioeconomic classes in the same racial conditions, and that probably led to the bridging that I described of people wanting to bring kids from Loveland Village and so forth. And yes, I think the worst circumstance currently is to be in that witch's brew that is race and poverty. And so how do you deal with socioeconomic stratification? How do you deal with the diminishing prospects of the underclasses? Again, I think it goes back to having people able to be educated for the jobs that are there. And unfortunately, we've lost time and ground on that basis. It's absolutely the case that if you are born into a family in which there is no working adult, or in which there are no prospects for a working adult, your prospects are pretty grim. But somebody has got to advocate for that child too. While we fix whatever we're going to do in terms of the economy and income distribution, we don't have time to lose another generation of kids waiting for those problems to be fixed. And so somebody's got to advocate for that child and have that child emerge despite socioeconomic circumstances. It might be a minister. It might be the Boys and Girls Clubs. It might be a tutor from Harvard. But somebody's got to advocate for those children, because while, yes, you can look at it at 4 years old, I don't believe that at 4 years old you're predetermined to be poor. I just, maybe this is one of those cases where I'm a social scientist too, and how you build your assumptions matters. And I just don't see that intervention at 5 isn't going to make a difference. If that's the case, then we're lost. All right? If it's the case that at 4 years old you're condemned to be where you are at 4 years old, then we're lost.
Can I ask her a follow-up question to your point? Sean Reardon's a Stanford professor.
Yes,
by
I
the
know.
way.
I know Sean.
Yeah. Part of the research is showing how the top 1% is increasingly controlling a greater percentage of wealth in this country, thereby decimating the middle class. Have you thought about this in the context of education, and do you think that this is a disturbing trend in American economic policy?
Well, look, I am one who would love to see greater income distribution, or evenness of income distribution. But I'm not one who believes that even income distribution is a goal in and of itself, because there are a few countries around the world that tried that, and they ended up on the ash heap of history. That was because what happens when you mandate, in some fashion, even income distribution? Now the incentive to actually do something about your circumstances begins to diminish. And you get even worse. What you learn is that it's not actually even income distribution. The 1% is now simply the political class, right? So if you're Leonid Brezhnev, it's not your wealth, it's that you're General Secretary of the Communist Party. And the nomenclature of the Communist Party are more advantaged than the 1% in the United States. So unfortunately, I don't see any human experiment out there that's actually ever succeeded in even income distribution, even though I would like to see more even income distribution. And if you look at the top 1%, ask yourself this question: how many of them started out in the top 1%? One thing that I really hope we lose is the class warfare language. And do you know why it is offensive to a lot of Americans? Because a lot of those people who ended up in the top 1 or 2 or 3% started out sweeping floors to make it through Harvard. So we have to be very careful that we're not talking about, the pyramid is going to exist in any society. It is by definition that you're going to have a top 1%. It's by definition. So the question is, how permeable is that wall to the top 1% or 10% or 50%, and how impermeable is it, how stuck are you if you're in that bottom 30%? And what troubles me right now is not the top 1%. Let them. What troubles me is the number of people that can't get out of the bottom 30%. And so I think if you think about it in that way instead, the term elite has gotten a kind of bad connotation,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But if I look at the elite in the United States, you and I are probably considered part of the elite, right?
Yes.
My parents never made more than $60,000 a year in their entire lives. So how permeable our class distinctions in the United States. I think that's what we need to worry about. And what is the role of education in making them permeable?
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Next question.
Thank you, Dr. Rice, for coming. In Afghanistan, there are young men who are choosing between career in farming opium and a few other opportunities. And in inner city America, there are young men who are choosing between whether I stay in school and whether I deal drugs. And you see this sort of tension play out in a lot of places, whether it's Colombia or the way drugs prop up North Korea, which is one of the big drug trafficking countries. And so I wonder if we think about the tension between the ways in which illicit drug trade creates all sorts of opportunities for insurgents, cartels to undermine functioning states, our neighbor Mexico being perhaps the best example, to what degree does the war on drugs operate then in tension with the war on terror? And is it possible to actually succeed at both, particularly when we want those young people to sort of say, as you experienced in your growing up, the real opportunities are in doing something like getting an education as opposed to slanging crack rock, as they say in hip hop.
Yeah. It's interesting because the same circumstances in a state or a weak state or a failed state that empower drug dealers, empower terrorists, empower people who traffic in humans, and empower people who deal arms. It tends to be places where the police are either corrupt or don't care, which some would say, or are not willing to exercise control for whatever reason, and that can be in a developed society. My cousin, Connie Rice, is very involved with the LA Police Department now in trying to better understand the gang problem in Los Angeles, and they're using some of the insurgent literature to try and understand what's going on in LA, where the gangs control whole territories. I mean, literally are the government in that part of the territory. And so there are actually a lot of commonalities between what you see in terrorism and ungoverned territory, corrupt officials, people who can pay just a little money to a kid because there are no other prospects and the kid does that. And so maybe the way to think about it is that you attack those problems. In counterinsurgency doctrine, that's what they try to do. They try to go into a village, say in Afghanistan, and they try to own the military folks along with the Afghan. They try to own the territory long enough to put in reconstruction projects and education projects and governance and so forth. And so I don't think they are in conflict. I actually think they come from, to a certain degree, the same source.
So just a push, right? In Afghanistan, the economy is something like 60% opium, right? So as long as there's all of this money to be made in opium because it's illicit, there really is no way for us to effectively develop a functioning state there.
Well, it's very hard because not only is the opium 60% of the economy, and it's probably a little high, but let's stipulate it's 30 or 40, all right? Not only do you have that problem, but you have the problem that then feeds and funds the Taliban.
Right.
Now, there are a couple ways that we are trying to deal with that. We had what we called a 5-pillar strategy, and it essentially hasn't changed in the Obama administration. First of all, you criminalize it so that some people will get out of it just because they don't want to be harassed. Right? Secondly, you realize that it's actually not the small farmer who's trying to make a living who's the problem here. It's the drug lords, and so you try to take down the drug lords. The problem in Afghanistan is sometimes they're linked up with government officials in a not very good way. Third, you do have to have alternatives for people. And we've tried crop substitution and alternative livelihoods. And one of the problems with that is you kind of incent people to grow more so that they can get more for their crops. So that hasn't worked perfectly. But in the provinces where governors have really taken this on and tried to establish security zones and then establish empowerment zones and economic zones, in some of those places it actually has worked, like Oruzgan province was one of the worst and is somewhat better. But it is one of the key problems in Afghanistan is this tie between the drug trade and the terrorists, absolutely.
Okay, next
Hi,
question.
good evening. I'm Vanessa Rodriguez. I'm a first-year doctoral student here. I want to thank you for sharing the story of your grandfather, and I was really moved by how he really utilized the community and also seemed to be a master of the benefits of local control in order to provide for the specific needs that the community had. However, I feel our country is really moving away from the idea of local control and individual responsibility with NCLB and with national standards. And not only do I fear the standardization of this, but also the precedent that it may set for people to not join together as a community as part of their individual responsibility, which I think was extremely powerful in the story that you told, and one that could lose that diversity that really is specific to a local level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this tension between federal policy and local control in education is a very real one. By the way, not something that most countries share. Most countries, it's national policy and national testing, and they're absolutely unashamed of it. As a matter of fact, they think it's what makes them very strong. If you are a German student and you want to get into gymnasium, you're going to take the same test whether you're in Bavaria or in Dresden. So it is a kind of American tradition, and it probably does reflect our diversity as well as our federal structure. I don't think there's anything wrong, though, with the federal government saying, if somebody doesn't read at third grade level, by the time they are third or fourth grade, they're probably not going to read, and that's not acceptable. And you're not going to get federal money if your schools do that, because we do have federal money flowing into education. And somebody has to call to account the issue of standards, and I have no problem with that being the federal government. Now, the problem with having standards, national standards, is well-known when people start teaching to the test. And that is a problem because I said the other night, I am a big believer in broad education. So it's not just math and science, it's also literature and music and drama and all of those things that make a complete person. And you will, if you're not careful, measure what you can measure. And it's a lot easier to measure certain things than it is to measure other things. So you have to be careful about that. You also can have local implementation of national standards. But what you can't have is a locality that says it's okay for our kids not to learn. That's not okay. And I think that's what NCLB was trying to say.
Just a quick follow-up. So in your mind, what could people do at the university level or even at the government level, I feel, in their language, so that as a country we understand that the standards are flexible? Because what I hear more of now is that the standards, right on the tail of the standards are the assessments and the curriculum design and the specific lesson plans. And so that I feel we have this nature, and maybe it's a type A personality of like, well, now we have these standards, we're going to now create this funnel of where we're going to be extremely specific. And as the first woman who asked you a question here, there's a lot that's lost when we get really specific about the content that we teach, such as, various studies of differing peoples.
No, I agree. Look, we can all agree, though, that there ought to be some things that everybody knows how to do, right? Everybody needs to know how to add, subtract, divide. I don't do that so well myself. I always thought I was missing class the day they did long division because I have a lot of trouble with it. But there are some things that everybody ought to be able to do. So those seem to me to be standards that make sense. You ought to be able to read at third grade level in third grade. Now, the content of what you read might be varied. And it might be that one way to get kids to read is to put them in a play and have them have the fun of actually learning to recite poetry, which is one of the ways we learn to read. And so, yes, I think the implementation, one thing we tried to do with the Center for New Generation was to make the day, the 3 to 6 period after the school day not feel like you'd been in the classroom doing the same thing. And so the teachers found innovative ways to introduce the material to the kids. That's what great teaching is about. And perhaps it starts with giving teachers standards, but more flexibility in how they get kids to that standard. But the standard's got to be met.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm curious what impact you think Barack Obama's presidency has had or might have on the American dream.
Well, I was very proud when President Obama was elected. As a matter of fact, the day of his election, I went down to the press room in the State Department to say so, because for America, after our history, to elect a black president was an extraordinary thing. And I think it's great that we've finally broken that barrier. I think that the interesting thing about what's happened is that Americans are very tough on our presidents. Right? The day that they're inaugurated, they're the smartest, most amazing human beings on the face of the earth. And a year and a half later, it's how did we ever elect him, all right? And I think President Obama is experiencing some of that, frankly. And it says to me that, that grand moment of the black president, well, now he's just the president and everything that comes with that. And that's not a bad thing. I do think that it has had an effect abroad of having people say, whoa, look at the United States. I mean, can you imagine that happening in Great Britain? Can you imagine that happening in France? No, not really. And people start looking again at, well, maybe America really is what it says it is, particularly given that for so many years, especially in the Soviet Union and in communist countries, the United States was painted as the most racist, backward place on earth. When I first went to the Soviet Union to study language, I will never forget being asked in my dormitory at Moscow State University, where are you from? And I said, the United States. Well, you're not an обычная американка. You're not an ordinary American. Well, I'm not. I said, well, yes, I am. Well, then how did you get here? I said, in an airplane. But you needed an internal passport. I said, no, that would be South Africa. So a lot of the myths and prejudices about America and the black experience even in America was even far exaggerated from what was true about an admittedly not great black experience if you were in 1962 in Birmingham. I think that a lot of that has broken down. Now, it started to break down earlier. It broke down when Ralph Bunche won his Nobel. It broke down when Colin Powell was the chief military officer, and people kind of said, whoa, that's a black man. And then, of course, you had two black secretaries of state. As a matter of fact, you had a black secretary of state and a black national security advisor at the same time, which had to be confusing to a lot of the world. But I think that final hurdle that the president of the United States could be black, that certainly has caught the attention of the world. And it's, as I said yesterday, it's caused a lot of countries around the world, not just the election of President Obama, but the forward march of black Americans to reassess what they're doing in terms of their own minority politics, and to begin to wonder if, despite all of our troubles and despite our tremendously bad history in this regard, that we could have come this far. What does that say about countries that thought they had this race thing licked a long time ago and now find that the United States has sprinted ahead?
Thank you.
Well, I wish we had more time. I know you probably do too, but Dr. Rice, I'd like to thank you for sharing your personal life with us, as well as the wisdom that's come from it. This was a very special evening for everybody here.
Thank you. Thank you.